You remember this is about 2 years ago. Gaddafi came to New York after a long absence because he had finally come in from the Cold, renounced his nuclear weapons, and therefore got a visa to attend the United Nations General Assembly. Well, we were in the UN mission, and I was standing there waiting around, and there was this enormous bedsheet right next to me, and Gaddafi was on the other side. Well, why the bedsheet? Well, it turns out Muammar Gaddafi does not like to live in houses or apartments. He likes to live in tents. He's a Bedouin. Plan A had been that he was going to rent Donald Trump's house in Bedford, New York, and pitch a tent in the backyard. The good townspeople of Bedford heard about this plan and passed a city ordinance, which meant something like no tents in Bedford this week. So plan B was that they pitched the tent in the lobby of the Libyan mission to the UN, which happened to have very high ceilings. So there I was, waiting for Gaddafi, across from this enormous bedsheet. And it had been hours, and we had been negotiating, and finally, after much negotiation, they assured us the interview was back on track, it was going to happen. And I said, well, we need to get going. This is New York, and I've got a camera crew here, and we're playing pain and triple overtime. They said, don't worry, he's coming. I said, when will we know that we're ready to start rolling? They said, you'll know. And at that moment, a number of very striking, beautiful African women walked out. They were all wearing military fatigues of various kinds. They were all wearing high-heel boots, and they all had Kalashnikov rifles strapped to their breasts.
Oh my God.
This is Gaddafi's Amazonian guard. They said it precedes him wherever he goes. I looked them up on Wikipedia the next day, and it said that they were all virgins.
Oh my God.
Which made me think, do not always believe what you read in Wikipedia. At that moment, a Libyan official comes out and he says, pray be silent, for the guide of the revolution approaches. And at that moment, Muammar Gaddafi walks in and the interview begins. So that certainly was a more dramatic entry than mine. Maybe for the next year's lecture. All you know, the Amazonian guard might be available for rent. But what I thought I'd do is talk a little bit about these extraordinary events taking place in the Middle East and how they relate to broader trends that have been taking place around the world. Because there's a tendency to look at these kinds of things in isolation. And I think it's very important to recognize the breadth and depth of what is going on in the Middle East. Think about this. Over the last decades, there have been so many events that have seemed likely to spill over or to produce some kind of broader conflagration. And they don't. I was in Iraq in 2006. This was the worst period for Iraq. Everything was falling apart. The country was in chaos. If you went and flew 45 minutes away to Jordan, which was the only place you could fly initially, and you had to fly using this corkscrew pattern to make sure that the missiles didn't hit the plane. If you fly to Jordan 45 minutes away, it was booming. It was as if there was nothing to worry about from the violence in Iraq. The same was true in Dubai. The violence in Iraq is remarkably self-contained. If you look at Afghanistan, the country is falling to pieces. You go to India, neighboring India, there's simply no effect. The Indian economy booms, the Indian society seems totally unconcerned. You look at coups that took place in Thailand. None of this spilled over the last 2 decades. It's a really remarkable thing about the globe, that people were expecting so many of those events to turn into broader events, and they didn't. But look at what's happened in the Middle East. A small shopkeeper sets himself on fire in Tunisia only a few months ago. And look at where we are now. 2 peaceful revolutions have dislodged dictatorships that have been firmly entrenched for decades. Libya is in a state of civil war with an armed insurrection against Gaddafi's 42-year reign. You have an ongoing revolt against the regime in Yemen. You have protests now spreading in Syria throughout the country in a seemingly unstoppable manner. And you have serious protests in almost every other place, from Bahrain to Jordan to Morocco. That's all happened in 3 months. Right? It tells you that there's something broader at work here. There's a broader, deeper cause. I would argue that we are witnessing a kind of Arab awakening that we have not seen in centuries. It may not be an exaggeration to actually say that the Arab people are for the first time trying to achieve a kind of sovereignty and independence that perhaps they have not had for 1,000 years. What do I mean by that? Well, the Arab world, Arab civilization as we know it today, burst upon the world stage in the 6th, 7th, and 7th centuries AD, and it brought to the world this new religion, a powerful, charismatic, religious leader, military leader, political leader, and the religion spread along with Arab power, and it spread very far, very fast. Islam spread to Portugal, to Spain, to Central Asia, and became one of the world's great religions in a very short period of time. But then a funny thing begins to happen in the Arab world itself. The Arab military supremacy and military prowess begins to wane, and you see in the Arab world a series of invasions and conquests in which the Arabs are now conquered and dominated by foreign armies. The Mongols, the Persians, and eventually the Ottomans. By about the 14th century, the Ottoman Empire was firmly in control of all the lands of the Middle East, all the lands of Arabia, and rules them. And Ottoman power continues to flourish throughout the area. This is an empire that you recall lasts for 500-600 years. At the end of the 18th century, as Ottoman power is beginning to wane, a small expedition from Napoleon, from Napoleon's France, goes to Egypt, and remarkably is able to conquer all of Egypt, defeat the Egyptian army. And then, in a short period of time, it itself is defeated or suffers a setback and leaves. Not because the Egyptian army defeated it, but because the Royal Navy defeated the French. So you begin to see the rise of another phase of imperial domination, this time the Europe's great empires. It is most vividly seen, of course, in 1919, after World War I, when the Ottoman Empire collapses and French and British diplomats literally carve and create the modern Middle East. They create whole new countries that had never existed before. Iraq, Jordan. They find old families in these places and turn them into monarchies. The ancient Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, for example, is a family that was stumbled upon by the British in 1920, and they decided to make them the ancient Hashemite kingdom. Very nice stationery and lots of nice royal traditions, but they don't date back that far. That reality of European imperial domination persists until the collapse of those European empires. 1945 is the beginning of the end, as it were, the end of World War II. But of course, the Middle East becomes the great chessboard for the superpowers. And the two superpowers inherit the European colonial mantle in the Middle East. And each superpower picks its own allies, funds them, supports them, guarantees their security, and thus that old great imperial game continues in the Middle East until the Cold War itself ends in 1989. And then you are left with one superpower. And all the countries of the Middle East have to decide they will either make their peace with the United States or they will look for other sponsors. And you found in a country like Syria, it found a sponsor in Iran. In a country like Libya, after trying various avenues for many years, it decided it would make its peace with the United States. Also, it thought a few years ago when Gaddafi decided to dismantle his nuclear weapons and come in from the Gulf. But then in the last 10 years, a strange thing happened to the America's imperial mission in the Middle East. And I use the word imperial here to mean a very large outside force that has the ability to dominate. I don't mean that the United States was actually colonizing any of these countries. But America's imperial mission begins to waver because the United States decides it has neither the will nor the capacity to play this imperial role. Why? Well, it loses the will because it realizes that the game America has been playing, and the Soviet Union was, and the British and French before, was to support some very tough, unsavory regimes. And these regimes had gotten tougher and more unsavory over the last 3 decades. But there was a cost to this. There was a side cost, what economists would call a negative externality. And this was that by supporting these brutal dictatorships, the United States had allowed for a system in which extreme opposition movements had grown in each of these countries. And in many of those cases, these were extreme religiously based terrorist organizations, and they all regarded the United States as one of their principal adversaries, if not their principal enemy, because it had supported all these regimes. And so there was a national security cost that became vividly clear on September 11, 2001, to having played this imperial role in the Middle East. And that began the wavering of America's will. You saw it in the Bush Freedom Agenda, which talked about pushing for democracy in the Middle East. You saw it in the way in which it specifically targeted and pushed for democratic reform in all these regimes. You see it in the WikiLeaks cables, where clearly American diplomats spent a great deal of time trying to push these regimes toward greater and greater openness. And you saw it with Obama, with the Cairo speech, and with the continued emphasis on reform in the Middle East. In other words, basically, our support for these regimes became qualified rather than unqualified, became one in which we were trying to persuade them to change rather than to stay the same. And this is not lost on the opposition movements in all these regimes and on the street protests in all these regimes. You can imagine that Egyptian protesters looking at all this would say, we bet that if we do a large street protest in Cairo and Tahrir Square, say, the United States will not unequivocally support the Mubarak regime if it were to decide to crack down. And that would have been a shrewd calculation because, in fact, the United States did not unequivocally support the Mubarak regime when it decided to crack down. That's the will, the intention. The second part of America's imperial mission is, of course, the capacity. America became an overextended empire over this last decade. An empire that had fought 2 wars, one in Iraq, one in Afghanistan, neither of which had come to any ready or easy conclusion, both of which had sapped it of enormous strength, both in terms of blood and treasure. An imperial power that was extended in other parts of the world, from Yemen to Somalia, and also one that had suffered the greatest economic calamity since the Great Depression. So those 2 factors, the loss of will, the loss of capacity, meant that the United States was not likely to play that old imperial game. And this began to open up the forces that were already building in the Middle East. Forces of a youth movement, stemming from a youth bulge, technology, democratization, all these forces were coming together. Take the youth bulge. There's a simple rule in life. Whenever you have too many young men in any country, you have trouble. If you look at history, you will basically find that wherever there are youth bulges, there's turmoil of some kind. And it's largely, I hate to say it, it's basically a problem with young men. The political scientist James Q. Wilson used to say, if you want to solve the problem of violent crime